Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews, with your host, Arlyeon. On this week's show, I'll be talking about Pugware's Into the Fray, a top-down shooter which serves as the third part in the developer's multi-genre Skautfold series. And if that's not how it's pronounced, sue me. Which, helpfully, was provided to me for review purposes. So, despite being a top-down shooter, Into the Fray has a fairly dense storyline, given its role as the third part in a series. The basic premise of go to a European island and put down a fledgling insurrection, a mad princess, and maybe some eldritch abominations to boot, should be simple enough to digest though. That it's helpfully provided in an optional prologue, which also serves to at least provide players with a somewhat Cliff Notes-esque overview of the series at large, is also a nice perk, but that doesn't detract from the simple point that on a narrative front, the game can be slightly daunting to newcomers to the series, given that it frequently ends up referencing characters, events, and elements that occurred in prior games, which can be a little bit confusing at times without the context. Also, if you're a history buff, try not to have an aneurysm. The Skautfold series takes place in somewhat familiar areas, but it's also in alternate history, and one which has been further fleshed out in each new game. With all that said, I overall did enjoy the story and the sort of Lovecraftian feel that its narrative gives off. I've also found myself enjoying the growing complexity of both the alternate history as it's told across the numerous games, and the growing complexity to the lore at large, as well as what's being alluded as being the overarching threat. Even if I did wish there was more opportunities to find out details about the creepy, ominous cloak character in Into the Fray. But, you know, one thing at a time, I guess. Now, the gameplay, on the other hand, is easy enough to pick up, if the game's tutorial wasn't any indication of this, given that it skips the whole prolonged explanation and tosses you straight into shooting cultists to pieces, with the aid of a few weapons you won't get to properly use until later in your rampage. But really, that's how I describe Into the Fray, as sort of a prolonged rampage where you shoot, stab, and dodge around over the course of its myriad stages, weaving between enemy projectiles and then riddling them with whatever sort of ammunition you have on at hand. And I guess, kicking barrels into their face. Yes, there's opportunities to chatter with NPCs, mostly in the game's hub area / the main base, and there's details to observe as you meander throughout the game's levels, but it's a far more arcadey experience than the prior iterations in the series, tossing out large groups of enemies for you to wade through across its myriad stages. Perhaps among the most satisfying elements of Into the Fray's combat, however, is the simple fact that you have a lot of tools at your disposal as the game progresses. Given that you not only have a rather varied arsenal of weapons you unlock by the game's end, in tandem with the fact that you can weaponize the various level hazards against the enemies within them. Which definitely helps, given that you're a fair bit more fragile than prior Skautfold protagonists. I mean, whilst there are difficulty settings which you can adjust this, for good or ill, the enemies you encounter are more than capable of putting you into the ground quickly if you get careless. I mean, yes, there is a rather nifty ability that lets you finish off weakened enemies to regain health, but that won't save you against the majority of the game's bosses, a lesson Into the Fray's first boss thoroughly taught me. That said, if you do find the base game too unforgiving, you can always try it in RPG mode, which starts you off as weaker than the vanilla form of the protagonist, but enables you to find a number of Yith stones squirreled away in every level, which allows you to actually increase your stats as opposed to remaining static, and actually grow to some rather impressive levels. Though given that you cannot repeat levels nor engage in a new game plus, this is more meant to provide you a custom playstyle than become omnipotent, and it can actually backfire on you if you don't seek out those Yith stones, since, as I just mentioned, non-repeatable levels plus starting out weaker than the base game. Which, given the non-repeatable nature of the levels, I'll admit I was a bit surprised that there's a world map you get to wander around on. I mean, it does give an idea of where the heck you actually are, but the free roam aspect of it seems largely in place that you can be ambushed while you wander to the next stage. I mean, there is 2 optional levels in the game you can explore, one of which is an absolutely sprawling gauntlet of rooms which culminates in a pair of neat secrets and a really weird, silly secret weapon. The other secret level there just seems to be mostly for the challenge though, and to give you more morale. A sort of stat which escalates as you clear levels and ambushes, and which is tied to the amount of starting ammo you get when entering levels. So I guess that's the other use of the ambushes. In any case, the lack of backtracking was also probably why I never got a chance to find all of the collectible pugs in Into the Fray, as I managed to miss, I think, 2 of them, and couldn't wander back to the levels to figure out where. So I'm not really sure what that bit of collectible hunting amounts to, but you know, cute pugs, maybe you'll have better luck than me. I mean, there's also some quality fashion options in the form of hats and masks that you can find across the various stages, which you can switch between while at the base, which are generally a fair bit easier to find, though, again, they suffer from the same inability to backtrack and seek out if you miss any. That said, they're purely for aesthetic purposes, so I mean, no worries. Though, I am really curious about what I missed, and I would think it would be a damn shame if I'd somehow missed the ridiculous straw hat, or the Plague Doctor mask. Anywho, Into the Fray sounds distinctly different from its predecessors in the series when it comes to its audio, as whilst its more ambient music might have found a home in Shrouded In Sanity or Usurper, its combat music sounds like it would be right at home in a Doom soundtrack, which, given its run-and-gun nature, is fairly fitting. Now honestly, if you folks have been following my channel for a while, you might realize that I have a bit of a sweet spot for decent sprite work, and if you've enjoyed Shrouded In Sanity or Usurper, this should be visually appealing to you as well. I'll admit that the perspective of the level design and smashing up bodies and objects was pretty enjoyable to see on just a purely visual catastrophe and chaos causing level. So, altogether, I enjoyed my time with Into the Fray, having enjoyed the silliness of running around gunning things down, and then figuring out absurd ways to level a room before it was reduced to a puddle of goo. As an experience, it is a fair bit more linear than its predecessors, and its focus on action does mean that it comes off as feeling a lot less creepy than its predecessors. Both a lack of a sanity system and a triple-barreled shotgun do help stave off feelings of horror. Still, if you want something to poke at for a couple of afternoons and to continue the series' storyline, I could recommend this game as a hit, albeit with some rough edges. And with that said, this brings this episode to an end, so I'd like to thank you folks for both tuning in and sticking till the end. Whether you agree or disagree with my thoughts, I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments, and for those interested in more indie reviews or interviews with the developers, feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you get notified when we have a new release. Oh, also lastly, join our Discord, link in the description and in the banner, so you can become a part of our community. It's quite cozy in there, I swear. Anywho, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.